Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in, and welcome to the second episode of our American Translators Association Chinese Language Division's podcast. Today, you are in for a real treat because I have with us today, as our guest, Mrs. Maureen Sweeney. She was the deputy chief of the interpreting staff for the Summer Olympic Games in Tokyo, Japan in 2020, or I may say 2021. In her role, she was responsible for recruiting, coordinating, and supervising a staff of professional interpreters and high level language volunteers numbering in the hundreds. So it is a huge role with lots of responsibilities. And I know that being involved in such high profile event is probably on a lot of linguists, language professionals' wish list. So today we have Maureen here to talk with us about that. She's not exactly an interpreter or translator herself, but she is very much involved in the industry. She works alongside the best interpreters and translators. So she's definitely no stranger to our profession. So today we get to pick her brain about the Olympic Games that just happened, which was, in my opinion, quite a miracle that it actually took place. So welcome, Maureen.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you inviting me to be on the show.
So starting off, would you be able to share with us just a brief history of how you got involved with the games and what was it like for you in the very beginning?
Absolutely. So I got involved in the games because, like many of the people who are probably listening to this podcast, I actually attended the Monterey Institute, now the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, but I was not an interpretation student. I was studying international public administration, and my plan was to go into sort of UN related work. Mm-hmm. However, while I was there, I met a gentleman named Bill Weber, who was the dean of translating and interpreting at the time. Right. And he was actually recruiting interpreters for the Atlanta Games in he was recruiting in 1995 for the Games in 1996. And sort of a funny story is that he posted a job announcement at the career development office. And there was a little sign that said, sign up for interviews if you'd like to be an interpreter at the Games. No one who's not an interpretation student should apply. And of course, I signed up and I showed up for my interview and I said, I'm sorry, Mr. Weber, I'm not an interpreting student, but I'd love to have 5 minutes of your time to talk about the Olympics because I love the Games. Fast forward about a month later, after a lovely conversation with him, I assumed I'd never hear anything back. I got a call from the Atlanta Committee for the Olympic Games asking me to do my final interview to be his assistant. So it's sort of all thanks to Miss and Bill Weber that I got involved sort of at the ground floor as the assistant to the chief interpreter for the Games there. Right. After Atlanta, I really enjoyed working in language services. I had a language background. I'd studied in South America and was pretty fluent in Spanish back in the day. After Atlanta, I joined the Olympics in Salt Lake City as a full-time employee. And I worked there for about 3 years as the head of language services and venue protocol, which is another sort of hospitality related program within international relations. Mm-hmm. After that, I started working as a contractor, a consultant to the upcoming games. So I worked with Torino, with Beijing 2008, and then Vancouver as well. And after Vancouver, I started also working as an expert advisor to the International Olympic Committee. The IOC employs sort of a stable of experts on certain topics to help upcoming organizing committees make their plans for future games. So then, in addition to working with the organizing committees, I worked with the IOC, and that sort of continued on and on. I guess fast forward again, for the Tokyo 2020 Games, my company was brought on to provide sort of the entire suite of services in the language area. So we were hired to provide professional interpreters, interpretation equipment, the junior interpreter program that I know you are involved with, as well as consulting on language volunteers. And I did that in collaboration with my partner, Alex Ponomarev, who was the chief interpreter. I was the owner of the company, he was the chief interpreter, and I was his deputy. So there's always a joke that I was both his boss and his deputy at the same time. He's also an Institute grad. But he and I, together with a team of other folks, worked for about 3 years prior to the games and then delivered all of the services this past summer.
That is truly amazing. So you started from just a sheer interest in it, just because you love the game, and look where it got you. So you just started from back in the 90s, and then every game after that, or almost every game after that, you have been a part of that. So just a quick question. So the IOC and then the local Olympic committees, they're two separate committees. Is that correct? So you the local ones?
Yeah, it's a really good point. So the way it works, I always try to explain to people, it's a little bit like, and this sounds terrible in some ways, but it's a little bit like a franchise in some ways. It reminds me of like McDonald's, in that there is the McDonald's headquarters, and it's an entity that exists. And then there are all these McDonald's around the world that sort of take direction and advice from headquarters, but they are individually operating businesses. So I would say the IOC is sort of like home base, headquarters. And then there are the organizing committees in each country that are selected generally, not always, about 7 years prior to their games. And the IOC provides them with support and advice and funding, recommendations. There's a lot of handbooks, policies and procedures. But ultimately, those individual organizing committees like Tokyo 2020 or like the upcoming Paris Games, LA, these are individual entities. So depending on the games, I have sometimes worked either for a games being paid for by the IOC or directly for that organizing committee. And the corollary there would be, it's the same for interpreters. There are interpreters that work directly for the IOC because the IOC has its own meetings, even unrelated to the games. But then the IOC also has meetings in the Olympic City at games time that are interpreted. And the organizing committee itself has its own suite of language services. So it gets a little confusing because it's all interconnected. And all of those organizations work together.
I see. But when it comes to language support or providing interpretation service, it's more of that would be more within the individual Olympic committee within the hosting city. Would that be?
Exactly. I would say that's very true, because each organizing committee really approaches language services quite differently as well. So you'll have some games where maybe they don't take languages seriously. There are other games where language is considered a big priority. It also really varies depending on, is it a base English speaking country, right? Because a lot of the services that are provided for the games are provided for journalists who generally, international journalists, all speak English. So you might have a lower level of service in a base English country than you would, let's say, somewhere like China or Japan, where less of the local population is going to be speaking English. So the mixture really varies a lot depending on the country.
I see. And I heard for this year, the Winter Olympics, or maybe not this year, next year, the 2022 Winter Olympics, the China Beijing Winter Olympics, they aren't really that extensive in terms of sourcing this international linguists to be there on the ground to give support. Is that true? They're doing everything by themselves?
I would say a couple of things. First off, it's important. I think one of the things people don't realize, and I didn't realize before I worked for the games, is the vast difference between a summer and a winter games. Compared to summer, So, for instance, in Tokyo, there were close to 50 venues. If you included both sport venues and non-competition venues like the Village or the main press center or the IBC, about 50 separate huge venues that are operating and providing various services or hosting competitions. Whereas at the Winter Games, you usually have less than 20. So it's less than half. And in fact, and the number of competitions is far lower. And when it comes to language services, if you think about who competes in the Winter Games, it tends to be very biased to the global north, let's say, right? Talking about a lot of countries, Scandinavia, Canada, United States, countries like Korea that are really successful. China's quite successful in their competitions there. But you can see a trend in terms of less languages overall, obviously, and then a lot more people who speak English again. And once again, when you get like more, both competitors and journalists who are primarily speaking English, the amount of interpreting that goes on decreases quite a bit. So there's that piece of it. I think Winter Games in general, it's always a lot smaller operation. And then in China, I think the other things that are affecting the situation are, they didn't do it that long ago. They did this in 2008. There are a lot of really great people who are involved with the games this coming year who didn't do it that long ago. So their reliance upon international experts is a lot lower because they have a lot of those, that talent available to them.
Right.
So I would say, I don't know that and I guess the other impact is obviously the obvious elephant in the room, which is the pandemic, right?
Right.
So I think that there are a lot of things that are sort of conspiring to make the levels of internationals kind of employed to be a lot lower, that have nothing to do with sort of maybe kind of stereotypes about, the Chinese not wanting to use anyone. I just think they're in a situation where they've really got to think about who they're going to bring in because of all the issues that are going on in the world globally.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So speaking of that, when interpreters get to the game, I'm sure they're needed in a lot of different situations. They're the journalists that will ask questions and they will have to relay the message back and forth. And then what are some major situations where you see interpreters are at work when they're involved with the games?
It's a great question. There's actually, at most games, there are four different levels and types of services that involve linguists of different kinds. So in interpreting, I sort of see it as, first off, sort of the first responders are the volunteers. And those volunteers are providing usually support directly to athletes, journalists, even sometimes spectators, Olympic family members on site in the venues. Now, there weren't nearly as many of them this past year in Tokyo because of the pandemic, but they were still there, and they would provide services for things like doping control, which is what they call drug testing. They provide services for mixed zone interviews. The mixed zone is when the athlete comes off the field of play, they've just either won or lost, and they sort of walk through this line of reporters. They're on either side of them, and volunteers are generally the ones that will help interpret if that athlete doesn't speak English generally, because it's going to be international journalists asking them questions.
Right.
So that's sort of the realm of the volunteers, those one-on-one athlete journalists, and they also do things like, a lost child or somebody in the medical tent. It's really those down and dirty language situations for volunteers. Right. The next level generally is the professional interpreters that are doing medal round press conferences and official meetings, IOC meetings, organizing committee meetings. In Tokyo, we added a third element, and that you alluded to earlier, the non-medal round press conferences. So by that, I mean, it's a preliminary round of basketball. It's not when gold, silver, or bronze are given out, but maybe it's a really interesting game. It might be a game, let's say in basketball, between China and Spain. Those are two teams that are really good teams. They're well regarded. There might be a lot of people that don't speak English there, and there might be a lot of interest in that press conference. In the past, they would have either had to provide their own interpreter or use a volunteer, but instead in Tokyo, we initiated what we called the junior interpreter program, which involved high-level, generally recent graduates from the Institute and other well-known interpretation schools around the globe who provided interpreting consecutively via MS Teams, which I have to say was not the most ideal platform for that interpreting, but we made it work. And this was a new initiative, and it was added in Tokyo because a lot of the sporting federations like basketball, like football, like hockey have sort of been complaining. Like we have these press conferences that aren't medal rounds, but there's a lot of press interest. And we'd really like to see interpretation provided so that we can communicate out to those, sporting outlets. So that was a new program that we instituted. It's never been done before. We don't really know if it will be picked up at the next games because, like you said, every organizing committee kind of gets to do their own thing.
Right.
But it was very successful, very well received. So we're hoping. And then the final kind of program that's available generally is translation, obviously the written word, and how each organizing committee kind of delivers translation is hugely different, and the amount of words that are translated. Some committees take it very seriously. Everything's translated in multiple languages. I've worked for some committees where they had budget restrictions and there was almost nothing that was translated. So it hugely variable, but always, some level of translation is provided.
So I think that is certainly encouraging news that both interpreters and translators are able to participate, because I know in the game, if they want to, because I know some translators aren't exactly comfortable being an interpreter, and then some interpreters don't really want to do the translator's work. So now we have this big old pot of opportunities for everybody if they want to join in, or at least there could be things that they could do.
Yes.
So that's very good. Now, we touched upon this a little bit earlier by this year going remote. Do you think now that the IOC, for the lack of better terms, had a taste of it, do you think they're going to want to continue, or at least this form of interpreting, or are they going to want to go back to in-person? I know that even for the interpreters on the ground in Tokyo, they were still delivering an interpretation from like a media center venue, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so it's interesting because initially, prior to the pandemic, we had already planned on providing simultaneous interpreting through a hub situation. So in the old days, prior to Tokyo, we would bring a very huge team of professional simultaneous interpreters, and they would actually have to take the buses out and go to the actual press centers and interpret. And it was, as you can imagine, really tricky because venues are all over the place. The transport is often a little bit challenging. And then the other part that's tricky is we're always just guessing who's going to win, right? We do a huge amount of analysis prior to the games to anticipate what languages will be required for each sport. But especially Tokyo was a perfect example of how you can analyze, and then the pandemic happens and the top 3 people don't come because they're not comfortable or somebody's sick, and then out of the blue you have more Italians winning medals than have ever won medals anywhere else. I think we just had a joke by the end. It was like, is another Italian? And Italian is a language that we have, but we don't have huge numbers of Italian interpreters at the games because usually, small country. Not a lot of other countries besides Italy speak Italian. I mean, I've got a little bit going on in Switzerland and a few other places, but it's mostly Italians. Whereas, for example, for Chinese, our team is quite large, right? Or our team for French or Spanish is larger. So this games, we had already planned on using a hub where we would, what we called the RIC, the Remote Interpreting Center, where we had 25 booths set up, and it was connected out to all of the press centers at the venues. And we were planning on using just that. Then, because of the pandemic, we were asked to come up with a new approach that would allow people to use their own headsets instead of the receivers that you normally would check out at a, when you get simultaneous interpretation at a meeting. We were asked to come up with a sort of a system, an app, where people could access the service via their smartphone, use their own headphones, and thereby eliminate the chance of, contamination via headsets. So we started working on that. And then there were requests to decrease the number of staff and interpreters that we're actually bringing over to Japan because of the limits on travel due to COVID. So at that point, we worked on improving the app to the point that we could actually bring in, and I think in the end we had about 26 interpreters that were actually working from California, Norway, Moscow, Geneva. They were everywhere. Hong Kong. We had people all over the place interpreting remotely, and that was a reflection of what we needed to do in response to the pandemic. Getting back to your questions, but do I think we will keep doing it? Absolutely. I think what everyone has realized, I think all of your listeners probably know as well, is there's a huge cost savings to be had when you don't have to pay travel and accommodations, especially for something like the Olympics where the travel is international. The accommodations is, minimum 17, 18, 19 days, per diems. We had some conversations with the people from the upcoming games in Paris, and they're absolutely interested in how they can utilize remote interpreting more to save money, frankly.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the biggest benefit offered by this remote interpreting. So I think a lot of event organizers are seeing this, and then they want to go forward with this technology. And frankly, I think, yes, it does save a lot of money. And for interpreters, it's not as stressful having to go through the whole travel ordeal and then having to adjust to the local time zone. And but I do want to say that we kind of miss out too by not being there.
I absolutely agree. I mean, I would say, as I mentioned, in addition to doing the games, I also am a partner in a language services company that's based in Seattle. And we do a lot of sort of more traditional meetings along with things like the Olympics. And one of the things we've seen is that there is a downside in terms of not getting the chance to sort of travel and see your colleagues and have that kind of interaction. But on the plus side, our business, and talking to other language service agencies, our business has exploded because we've had a lot of clients who have come to us and said, oh, wow, we can get interpreting without having to pay this incredibly high price. Sign us up. I mean, we had clients that, in the past maybe did 1 or 2 meetings a year, and now they're doing 8, 9, 10 meetings a year. We had, this is an interesting example. We did a lot of initial meetings with the Biden campaign for the presidency, and they were very confused. That's not a normal thing to do in political campaigns. But once they realized it worked and they could do it, we did, 50 plus meetings. And that was like from a client that normally would never, ever, ever, ever consider doing interpreting. So I feel like, I guess it's take the good with the bad. I feel like there is a lot more work coming for people. But it is, it's a bummer. It's fun to get to travel once in a while. And
yes,
it's living just virtually.
Yes.
What are you going to do?
Yes, good and bad. So I save the best for the last before I take too much of your time. So for those of us who actually still want to get in on the games, and whether it's for experience, or whether it's just to check off that item on their wish list, just to say that, oh, I've been involved in this and that Olympic Games. So for those of us who still want to do that, do you have any advice for them or any tips, and how can they get involved? How can they get really actively seeking out that opportunity?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a few different things that you can do. Obviously, if there's going to be an actual Olympic Games in your host city, you're in a prime position, right? You can volunteer, you can connect with people from the organizing committee directly. I do think obviously that can be challenging because, unless you live in Beijing, you live in Paris, you live in Milano Cortina, you live in LA, those are the places that are coming up on the docket. Another way to kind of get your foot in the door is to try to get involved with World Cup events, because you have the same federation. So for instance, coming up this summer in Eugene, Oregon is the World Athletics Championships. That's a huge international event. It's essentially the last step of competition as a athletics athlete, a runner or a pole vaulter or sprinter that you would have before you make it to the games. They will have, although the World Cups don't necessarily 100% replicate the services of a games. There are often opportunities to get involved and to sort of meet the people who are involved. And even if it isn't a traditional interpreting position, there are, bilingual host positions, and there are other international relations related jobs. And generally, in the Olympics and in sort of the international sport federation world, language services falls within the international relations heading. And within international relations is generally language services, hospitality, protocol, because all of those services are targeted to sort of the international VIPs involved in the sport. So I would say look at opportunities also at World Cups or World Championships. There's the World Games coming up in Birmingham, Alabama. That's a huge event that is all of the sports that aren't on the Olympic roster. So like roller derby and I don't know, there's so many inline skating. And so that's a huge event that's coming up, and we'll have international participation from around the world. There's also the World University Games coming up in Lake Placid. Again, they'll have a language services program. They'll have a lot of the same sports that then go on to the Olympics. So I think if you sort of start thinking about how you can connect up with Olympic adjacent or related events, that's a nice kind of path to go on.
That's very good. Maybe I will try some of that myself again.
Absolutely.
And I actually quite look forward to the games that they're going to have in Los Angeles. That's where I live, and I think yes, I'm really, really excited because being involved with the Tokyo game, it was quite fun. So definitely worth it. All the late nights staying up and then.
Yes, thank you so much. I know that that's one of the issues with remote work that I'm sure everyone that listens to this is getting used to is the time zone issues. And I know that it was tricky because Tokyo, the time zone does not align with the West Coast of the United States where a lot of our junior interpreters were living. So we appreciate the late nights.
Okay, I think with that, I would want to maybe conclude today's episode. I hope all of our listeners have enjoyed listening to Maureen's insight. Those are really good, valuable advice.
Thank you very much. It was great to talk to you. I really enjoyed it. And yeah, keep in touch. Let me know if anyone comes through with questions. I'm always happy to respond if I can.
Okay.
Thank you once again, Maureen, for taking the time to talk with us today. It was truly a pleasure.